Now that we've done our Blast from the Past tribute to Alice Paul, let's flash forward to a local feminist here in Springfield, Ohio, who teaches in the communications department at Wittenberg University, the lovely and amazing Dr. Cunningham. So now today we have the very lovely Dr. Cheryl Cunningham here today. We're going to talk a little bit about women in politics here in our local community. Cheryl, thank you so much for coming down here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, very awesome to have you. So tell us a little bit about, I was looking a little bit about your past, and I noticed that you had your bachelor's in English and your master's in English, and then kind of took a little bit of a curveball with your PhD, kind of did some communication. Any particular reason, or?
Yeah, so yeah, both my BA and MA are in English. I decided though, so I took a year off between getting my master's degree and going into a PhD program to decide if I really wanted to do that or not. And I decided that I was still interested in studying texts, right? Because that's what you do as an English major, right? You study texts, you look at different books, you make arguments about them. But I became really interested in the types of texts I was studying, right? And I really actually wanted to study political texts. I wanted to study speeches. I wanted to study advertisements. I wanted to look at those kinds of things, and also media coverage, right? So that's where and I thought maybe I could do that in some English programs if they had a strong rhetoric component, but a lot of the English programs, at least the ones that I was familiar with, had a stronger literature focus. So then I started looking at communication programs. And then I found this thing called political communication, right? Which seems obvious, right? Which seems obvious, but having been in English for so long, I just hadn't really, I didn't know, I hadn't really explored. And so I ended up actually at the end of my master's program writing my master's essay about politics. And then I kind of used that as a jumping off place, even though I had mostly studied literature. So I made the move just kind of on my own and with the guidance of a mentor that I had at the time, because I kind of shifted on her, and she was like, well, do what you want to do, right? And so that was really great for me. And so then I got accepted at the University of Washington, which has an amazing, actually, political communication program, which I knew that it was good, right? But I didn't know how good it was until I got, and I was like, oh, wow, this is really highly reputable program. So that was nice.
Good.
Yeah.
Perfect falling in. And so would you say that your interest in politics was mostly spawned by college, or was it something that you had also younger, like were you involved like maybe in your local community growing up or anything like that?
It was mostly something that I actually think developed not even in college but in graduate school for me. Just the sensibility of the types of things. Although I will say in college, I went to a small liberal arts college in Ohio actually, and my political sensibilities were developed there to some degree. But when I was at Ohio University and in my PhD program, I also did whatever you needed to do to get a women's studies certificate, right? So I started bringing those two things together.
Okay.
Yeah. Class too.
And with this class, and I'm assuming with politics, you cover Alice Paul, our lovely lady of discussion for this. And I'm curious with the media representation. How would you find that she was accepted in American consumers with the newspapers and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, from what I've seen of Alice Paul, right? So a member of the National Women's Party, which at the time was considered, right, that sort of more radical part, right, of the suffrage movement, right? And they were considered more radical because of the sort of direct action tactics that they used, right? So doing things like picketing outside the White House, right, at the start of World War I, made them very unpopular, right? So we had that, and then we also had, but doing hunger strikes, like when they got sent to prison, and just the idea, right, of sort of middle-class women going to prison was, for this kind of political action, right? And so this whole thing, I mean, but she definitely had to, there was a split between the activists of that time, right? So you had people like Carrie Chapman Catt, who were not
more conservative,
right? And they're not going to take that line of Alice Paul. But I always look back. I talk about social movements a lot too, and you have to think about, well, what happens to a social movement if it doesn't have what's considered a radical element, right? And even when we look back at what she was doing now, right, trying to get women the right to vote, right, doesn't seem very radical. And so this is something that I really encourage students to think about, right? What does it mean to be a radical? And how does a social movement progress or get things done without that kind of edge, right? And is there a difference between being radical and being extreme, right? I don't know, you know, then you start in terms of the way that we talk about these things. So she was really interesting, and I still wonder, you know, if we would have gotten the right to vote as soon as we did, without those kinds of actions, without the kinds of things that she encouraged other women to do. I don't know, but I'm glad.
Would it have actually made it that fast? Yeah.
Yeah, would it have happened as soon, right? Because of World War I in particular, right? I mean, that was a big deal. And so in getting into that, and that was a tough decision to make. You pick at the White House.
In the time of war, yeah.
Yeah, because then then you're looked at as a traitor to your country, right? And then even put in an even more radical box, right? When what you're asking for is basically, you know, equal representation under the law as a citizen.
So just jumping into the multiple waves of feminism, and with it being, you know, set in stone in academia because it's in the past, do you think that third wave will be able to make room for a more political agenda, or do you think it's always going to be more of the bubble gum,
yeah, like bubble gum and nail polish.
Yeah, nail polish, like girl power, not necessarily politically savvy movement?
No, I don't. And I do think that sometimes it's very broad. And like we were talking about, it's very hard to settle on what exactly third wave is because we're sort of in the middle of it. So we don't know exactly, right? I know it's been critiqued for being apolitical, right? But I do think that there are a lot of young women who are out there doing a lot of really interesting stuff, you know? I mean, even on our campus, you know, you'll have somebody putting together a clothing drive, you know, for some group in the community, right? And so it's like there are little pockets of things like that that people are already doing. So I think that, but I do think that third wave is going to have to really bring in that idea of political involvement and what it means and what it looks like, right? So, you know, creating a blog, I mean, I've actually had this discussion. I have a friend who's trying to figure out what we actually think political involvement or activism is, right? You know, is it giving money to an organization, or is it going out and protesting something? Like, what does it look like? And so I think we're also in a time, too, because we do have all of these different media forms that make it easier to disseminate information, that what we even think of as activism may also be shifting, right?